Hi everybody, welcome to my channel Frugalisama. My name's Sam and this is where I talk about all things sewing. Today I've got a sew along for the ruffle sleeved blouse and dress by Dressy talk. So I'm going to take you step by step through making the blouse. The instructions are okay actually, but there are a few unusual features to this blouse, so I thought I'd do a sew along so it makes things a bit clearer. But first of all, I'd just like to say please consider subscribing, hit the notification bell which will tell you when I bring out new videos. That's normally on a Friday when I do a Frugal Fridays video. Midweek I usually have a tutorial or some tips and tricks, and on a Sunday I usually do plans and reviews and sew-alongs and that sort of thing. I do try to focus on frugal sewing, so hence the name Frugalisama, and this pattern is a free pattern. So you just need to subscribe to their newsletter and they will send you the pattern for free, and it is just a print at home pattern. It is only about 24 pages or something like that. So some of the things that are a little bit different about this top and dress are this little Gore detail that is under the sleeve there, and the ruffles, and the actual finishing of these ruffles. I'm going to show you how to do that on an overlocker. You don't need to have an overlocker to make this dress. If you don't have an overlocker, then you'll need something like this. This is a rolled hem foot for your sewing machine. I don't go into details of how to do that. I'm just going to focus on doing that on the overlocker. So if you do have an overlocker, I've got a Singer overlocker, and what you might find is you might be wondering what that was that came with it, and that's what you need to dig out in order to do this. And it's either called a converter or a spreader. So you might put that somewhere safe. You're going to need that if you're going to do it on the overlocker. It does recommend 1.9 metres of fabric, but I managed to get the dress out of 1.5 metres of fabric. I made the size 46. So the sizing goes from a 33-inch bust up to a 45.5-inch bust, and that is a 36-inch hip up to a 48.8-inch hip. And it does come in two height sizes, does this, so if you're a little bit taller like myself, then you probably won't need to do any grading. That's already there, so you just need to watch out that you're downloading the correct one. So they've got a height for people up to 5'6", and then a height chart for somebody over 5'6". So other than the rolled hem and the Gore under the sleeve, you've got this is a top stitch down the front here to make a bit of a feature of it. Quite a high-low dipped hem there, and on the dress you've got pockets as well. So the fabric recommendations for it just says a medium or lightweight cotton. So this is like a shirting cotton that I've used on here, and it gives you quite a pronounced flounce at the sleeve. This one is a little bit lighter weight, and I've actually bought this from the shop that I work in Coat Fabricate in Murfield, so I'll link the fabric below because we've just got this in. And this is just a very lightweight cotton, so the flounces aren't quite so pronounced. So I'll just show you it. This is what I've got left out of 1.5 metres, so it's not a lot. You might not want to risk just getting 1.5 metres, but I know for a fact that this size 46 will fit on, and you can get both flounces on it as well, and I will show you that in the video. So you can see it's got a certain amount of drape to it, but it's not overly drapey. The white cotton that I used on the under flounce, that's a little bit more drapey, but it is too see-through for me to wear as a blouse. And you could use a viscose. The viscose will give you a lovely drape on the sleeves. So within this sew along I've included how to layer the pattern pieces and the tutorial for using the overlocker, and just a step-by-step approach to sewing it, and a few hints and tips of how to sew it a bit more efficiently. Doesn't take very long to make. What I haven't included is how to make your own bias binding. I've got a separate tutorial that I brought out the other day for doing that, so I will link to that at the end for you to make your own bias binding out of a 10-inch square of fabric. It doesn't actually tell you on the instructions how much bias binding you need. I found that just a little bit over 1 metre was plenty, so if you're using shop bought, about 1 metre should do it. Because you need it to go around the neckline, and I think that worked out about 85 centimetres, and then you just need a little bit extra to go over these two gores at the top here, so less than 10 centimetres each. So you should get away with about 1 metre if you're buying it. And you could also do the hem in bias binding as well. I find with a deep curve on a hem, it can help go around the curve, but I haven't used that. I've just done a double hem on the bottom of my dress and top. So I will put timestamps on everything so that if you want to watch it all the way through, you can do, but then if you want to come back to it and just find little bits that you might have got stuck on, then you can find those easily. So I'll put the timestamps on that relate to each different part of the process that's within the instructions. So onto the sew along. Okay, so first things first, you will be printing off a sheet that's got a test square on. So you just need to measure that, make sure that it's 10 centimetres by 10 centimetres or approximately 4 inch by 4 inch. This I think is a European pattern, and everything will be in centimetres. Any measurements will go back to approximate inches. Your second job is to have a look at the size chart and see what size that you want to print off. For the top, I measured between a 46 and a 48 for my bust measurement, and I was closer to a 50 for my waist measurement. So I actually, for the first time for the top, printed off 3 sizes because I thought I was going to have to grade. Problem with doing that with this pattern is there's no way of distinguishing lines between sizes. So everything has got a dash or a dot. It gets quite confusing between the sizes. So I actually went over it with a highlighter, then took some measurements off the pattern piece and thought that looks really narrow, and actually ended up with the top cutting the larger size. So on this one I ended up cutting a size 50 for the top, and then I had to take it in. So for the dress that I'm making today, I've just printed off one size. It's just less confusing. But that's just something that you need to watch out for if you're going to have to grade between sizes. It is a little bit like, you can see here, there's no colour coding and there's only dots and dashes. The other thing to take note of, and I'll hold this one up because it's a bit clearer, is that although I've only printed one size off on here, you've got your cutting lines and you've got your seam allowance drawn in. So you've got a 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and that's actually marked on the pattern. That's not a cutting line, that is the seam allowance marked onto the pattern. So that makes it even more confusing if you've got 3 sizes like I have on here. So if you have a look at your first sheet that you print off, it does tell you that you've got a layering option, and I will go through with you on the computer on how to do that and how to actually take off the sizes that you don't want, and then you've not got thousands and thousands of lines like a mad road map, and it's a little bit clearer for you. Open up your PDF document, and in the top left you will see this layering option, which is the 3 tiles. Click on that, and then you will just need to click on the layers that you don't want, and as you can see, the document is losing all the layers that you don't want until you're left with the one that you do want. Keep the top ones on, that's your notations. So the only other thing I've got to say about printing really is that you just need to make sure that you print to your actual size. Once you've measured that test square, then you know that you've got the right size. And when you're sticking it together, I've just got mine stuck together and not cut out just yet. There are only 24 pieces, so it's not much of a job to do. It's organised so you've got 6 rows of 4. You don't have to stick them all together. So you can see on here the sleeve flounce is just 4 sheets which I've stuck together there, and then the second sleeve flounce and the pocket and the go day are all on one sheet there, and I think it'll be the same for all sizes. But what you've got in the bottom there is just the bottom of the dress, and I'm just going to separately stick that together. And then the front and back pieces, 2 across and 1, 2, 3, 4 down. So you don't have to stick everything together. You don't have to religiously stick 4 together and then stick those 4 to the ones on top. You can just get away with just sticking the backs and the fronts together and then the flounces together, and you've not got much taping to do. It took me about 20 minutes, it didn't take long at all. I'm just going to go cut around my pieces. I'm not going to show you all that, it'll be too boring, and then I'll come back to you. Okay, so I've got all the pattern pieces cut out, and what you should have is a front piece, a back piece, 2 fancy dancy little flounces. So you've got a big one and a small one. A rather small pocket piece. It'll be big enough on the hand, but it is quite small in terms of pocket pieces, is that. And then we've got this Gore. And I think this is the point of difference on this sewing pattern, is that this is something that I've never actually used before. I think it just gives you a little bit of extra room under the arm there. So what I've done on this pattern piece is just put my own little notations on, just to make it easier for me when I come back to it next time, and for you for clarity when I'm sewing this. So essentially what we've got is, I'll just show you the front piece as an example. The front piece has got the option to do the top, so that's your cutting line if you want to do the top. I would say that that top is closer to a tunic length on me, and I actually took the top down by about 1.5 inches, maybe 2 inches. I actually cut it off at the bottom. So that's just a little note on that one, and then you've got your bottom piece. On the bottom piece you've got a seam line. I mentioned before that you've got, this is your cutting line, your outer bit's your cutting line, that's your seam line. So nowhere on that pattern instructions can I see what the hem allowance is. But just by measuring that there, I can tell you that the hem allowance is 1 centimetre. So what's a little bit different on this pattern is that rather than the traditional little triangles that you have for notches, you've just got, I'm just showing you this one so you can see it, you've just got these little lines across. So those are your notches, and I never ever omit my notches. I know some people like to fly by the seat of the pants, but I always mark them in. And what I've done on this pattern is I've marked the notches. I've actually cut them out so that you can see where the notches are. And I've actually noted on the pattern what each notch is for. So we've got at the top here, we've got a notch for the flounce. So the green is a flounce, that's the top of the flounce, and the bottom of a flounce. The flounce is like the sleeve part. Then the blue one here is for the bottom of the gore, so it's just underneath that flounce. So it can be a bit confusing once you've got it all cut out onto your fabric. And then the pink ones underneath are the pocket pieces. And what I've also done, it's marked on this pattern, that this is the back piece, not the front piece. Did I say front piece earlier? This is the back piece. It just says fold line on there. Traditionally, you would have this square bracket to denote a fold line. So I've just gone ahead and drawn that on so that you can see. Another little note to remember is at the top here, the neckline, at the front and the back neckline, you will need a little bit of extra fabric if you're going to do self-bias binding. And it's ever so slightly smaller. I would say that that is 0.7 of a centimetre or 7 millimetres rather than the full 1 centimetre seam allowance there. So it's ever so slightly smaller. It doesn't say anywhere on the pattern what seam allowance that you're going to have to make, but that would depend on the width of bias binding that you cut. So I've also marked all the notches on the gore piece. So you can see here you've got a front and a back notch. At the front you've also got an extra knot, and that lines up with your dart at your front. On the pocket piece you've got just 2 little notches that I've also drawn in as well, and they line up perfectly with the pocket pieces on there. And then you've got several marks on your flounces, and I've marked those as well. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 on each, and they will align with each other. You'll actually sew those 2 together before you sew them onto the armhole. You've got 2 flounce marks at the front of the pattern piece, 2 at the back, which equals 4 on each, and they will be aligning up. I would just make sure that you mark all those on your actual fabric, because it will get a little bit confusing if you don't. The other thing that you need to know is that on these flounces there's no seam allowance marked, and that's because you're doing a rolled hem. If you've got a serger or an overlocker, I'm going to show you how to do a rolled hem on the overlocker, and if you're going to do that, that would be my first job, is to, once I've cut out my fabric, is to overlock and do the rolled hems on these first, so that you're only adjusting your overlocker once, because the instructions tell you to sew the shoulder seams together, and then you overlock them. Then you would do the neckline binding, then you would do the flounces, so you would have to change your settings on your overlocker, and then you go back to the front central seam and do the side seams and all the rest of it. But if you do the flounces first, then you're not going backwards and forwards moving your overlocker about. So it's just that's just my top tip of the day. So I'm going to go ahead and cut out my fabric, and I will come back to you. Okay, so I've got all my pattern pieces laid out over the fabric here, and as you can see here, we've got the front piece which isn't cut on the fold. This has got a seam line down it, and that's so that you can do the V at the neckline. You need 4 pocket pieces, so I've got 2 pockets on there, and then the back piece is cut on the fold, and then you've got these flounces down here. So I've got 1.5 meters of fabric. It's 1.5 meters, 150 wide, and I can quite comfortably get the size 46 all on here. The smaller flounce goes on the top and the larger flounce goes underneath. I'm cutting the larger flounce on a contrast piece of fabric, but I just wanted to demonstrate that you could get it all on if you want to do it all in the same fabric. So I've just got 0.5 meter of a contrast fabric here, and the large flounce will go on there quite comfortably. The diameter of this, it's like 38 centimetres on this size, so you will need 0.5 meter, but you will have some spare. So you could either cut your bias binding out of that or just save it for another project. If you're going to do same as me with a self bias bound, you'll need like a 10-inch square from somewhere. 10-inch square is going to be plenty to do self bias binding, or you can use your own shop bought bias bounding. You can use the same as the main fabric. You can use anything really. It's up to you whether you want to make it contrast or whether you want it to blend in. You could also cut a bit extra and do the hem with a bias binding. That's also an option. It's quite nice on a curved hem to have a bias bound hem, and you can do that on a contrast, just give it a bit of extra interest. So I'm going to go ahead now and cut all my pattern pieces out. I'm not going to film it because I think that's going to be a bit tedious for you. I'm using a cutting mat and rotary cutter. When I come to cutting out the flounces, I'll show you with scissors, and then I'll show you how easy it is on a rotary cutter, but for the rest of it I'll just cut round it. So I've got all my pattern pieces cut out, so I've got my little flounces cut out here. I've done that one with a rotary cutter, and I've done that one with the scissors, and I've just done it on a fast motion. Just wanted to show you how it can be done with a rotary cutter. I know a lot of people say that they can't go around curves, so that one's cut with scissors. I'm not sure that one's quicker than the other, but I just use a rotary cutter. That's my preferred method. And what I've done is I've kept hold of the inner pieces from each of the curves. Don't throw those away. I'm going to use those as to practice on when you're doing the rolled hem, because the curves reflect the curves that you're going to be doing. There's no point practicing on a straight piece of fabric when you're going to be doing a curve, so these will be handy for practicing on. And I've also cut out, this is actually an 8-inch square because that's the biggest I could get off the fabric that I had left of fabric to make the bias binding to go around the neckline, and then you will need a little bit to go at the top of these gauze, just a tiny little bit to go at the top of each of these. I do have a separate bias binding tutorial of how to do that. I won't go into that in this video because it will make it too long, but I'll link that at the end for you of how to make the bias binding. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to do the rolled hem on these flounces on the serger. So that's the first thing that I'm going to do, and then we'll go to sewing the rest of it up. Just one quick note. When I was cutting out, you can't tell, this fabric is very, very difficult to tell the right side from the wrong side. It's very, very similar. So I determined what I wanted to be the right side, and I cut right sides together. That's just makes it a little bit easier for me. And then I could do any markings on the wrong side. You can barely see these, but you can just see I've put a little black mark where that notch is, just in case I go away and get bored and forget. So to set up your machine for a 2-thread rolled hem, open the case of your machine, and you just want to make sure that your knife's up out of the way, and then grab your converter or spreader, and you'll notice there that there's quite a rounded part. It wants to be that way up, and the rounded part is going to be going into this hole here on the upper looper. You're converting the upper looper. So slot that in, that goes in quite easily with my tweezers, so hopefully you can see. like that. Just firmly press it with your finger or your thumb and it should just slot in behind. If I wasn't at such an awkward angle it'd be a lot easier. And that's your upper looper converted. You're going to need your lower looper threaded and your right needle threaded. If you've already got your machine thread, you can just snip the existing threads and pull it through. If you need to rethread it, then you can just rethread your yellow thread and your green thread, which is the right needle. And I'm not going to go into how to do that. I've got a video on how to thread up the Singer machine. Everybody's machine is slightly different. That's what you need to do next. Make sure your tension discs are down at 0 and that your presser foot is up. So just make sure that your threads are underneath the presser foot on top of the needle plate. So you now need to adjust the lower cutting blade to make it line up with that R there. So this is the dial to do it with, and you just keep turning it until it lines up with that R. Hopefully you can see that. And the R is for, you guessed it, rolled hem. And that's that. You also need to adjust this stitch width finger, and you just do that by pulling it towards you, just to the forward position there. So bob your knife back into its correct position down there, close up your cover, and then you just need to adjust your stitch length dial. So the F means fine, and you just want it somewhere between the fine and 2. So you can adjust that as you go, just to see what you like. And the next bit is to need to adjust your tension dials here. So the needle wants to be around about 0.5, and you can see there's a plus and a minus, and this is where you're lining it up. So around about there, and then right up to 6 for your looper. And again, you can adjust that. You have a practice with the pieces that you saved earlier. Different fabrics might react differently, and you just have a play about and see what you like and the effect that you want. So 0.5 will give you a narrow hem. If you prefer a rolled hem, then you need to turn it up to around about 4. We'll try it on the narrow hem first. We'll have a look at that, see how we like it, and then we'll have a go at the rolled hem. So taking a piece of scrap, this is from the inside of the flounces on the blouse that I was working on. Try and work like for like, so similar fabric, and if you're going around a curve, then practice on doing around a curve rather than going on the straight, so you can have a look at it and see what you like. So there's a narrow hem. That's for that side. That's that side. Ideally you shouldn't be cutting anything off. Turn it up to 4. We'll have a look at that. And that's your rolled hem. That's just how to get the converter in, and you just need to play with your dials and have a look at your manual. Each machine's different and each fabric will be different as well. I've decided after a bit of faffing about that I prefer the narrow hem. That's the narrow hem, and that's the rolled hem. I don't like how you've got bits of fabric coming through with the rolled hem. The narrow hem seems a lot neater to me, so that's the one that I'm going with. And I'd also advise removing your other needle that's not being used as well, because if I bring this in really closely, you can see, I don't know if you can see it or not, but I can see there's little holes where the needle, the second needle's gone in. I've been a bit lazy really, but yeah, you should really remove that second needle that's not being in use. I'm going to do the narrow hem on both of those, and then we'll get to sewing the rest of it up. So just to clarify what it is we're sewing on the flounces, it's the outside curve, this curve here, not the curve with the notches. I know if I was a novice that I would probably try and do the wrong bit, and you need to make sure that they're going around the machine the same way up. Just to show you how I go around a curve when I'm serging, just spread my fingers on the top of the machine bed and just feed it through, twisting my wrist. and you're just keeping that fabric butt up to the blade. You're not really wanting to cut anything off. I am doing a little bit, but it's not too bad. You're just wanting to keep it butt up to that blade and just feed it through with your fingers. Okay, so I have just moved the order of construction around a little bit and done these rolled hem edges on the edges of flounces so that we don't have to mess about with the machine in the middle of sewing. You're only having to change the machine once. So my overlocker is back to its normal settings now. Okay, so first step after we've finished our flounces, this is the first step in the instructions, is to sew your bust dart. So you should have already marked on pattern pieces where the bust darts are, so you should have 2 little notches there and then the bust point there. So pin your bust darts right side together, and it's up to you whether you draw a line in or whether you just do it by eye. I do it by eye because I've been doing them a long time, but if you prefer, you can just draw a line from where the notches are to the point of the dart. So if you've never sewn a bust dart before, then what you want to be doing is starting at the cut edge of your fabric, not in the middle, and giving it a back stitch there, and then sewing just a stitch or 2 beyond the marking, and then you will just go in and tie it off. Don't back stitch, just tie it off, and I usually give it a double knot. Give them a trim. Once you've sewn your darts, you press them up, not down. It's unusual is that, but the instructions are telling you to press them up, and that's how it's been drafted, to press those bust darts up that way rather than press them down. Next step is to sew your back and your fronts at the shoulder seams. So hopefully you will have marked clearly which is your back and which is your front. I've made little markings on the wrong side of the back. The right side of my front is obvious because I've got the darts in, so that's easy enough. So this is before you sew the centre seam. Seams are sewn at 1 centimetre, and then they are suggesting that you finish with an overlocker. Obviously, if you don't have an overlocker, you don't have to do that. You can zigzag stitch, or whatever's your preferred method of finishing seams. You can do a French seam, but it's a bit narrow. You'll probably have to do 1/8 of an inch and then 1/4 of an inch and not trim it down. It's a bit narrow on a 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. If you haven't got an overlocker and that's what you're going to do, you could always give it a bigger seam allowance, because these patterns have been designed with the seam allowances and the cut lines drawn on to the pattern. You could just cut it out at the seam allowance and add your own 5/8 of an inch seam allowance on if you want. You could do it that way, but I'm doing it on an overlocker today. Okay, so shoulder seams pinned, and we're going to go sew those at 1 centimetre seam allowance, finish the edges, press the seams to the back. After you've sewn your shoulder seams and serged them together, if you are doing serging, this is, centre seams need overlocking because they are pressed apart and then top stitched. So you can do that at the same time as you're actually doing your shoulder seams, just to save a little bit of time. Okay, so we're on step 3 of the instructions here, and there's 2 options. Essentially, the options really are giving you the option to use ready-made or to use your own bias tape. So obviously we're using our own today, but you can use some shop bought. And you just need to go around the neckline, measure it. So you just need to measure roughly around your neckline. Having more is better than having less. I'm just doing it quickly here. And we've got, calling that about 80 centimetres. Made the bias binding and pressed it together, wrong sides together. I've cut this at 1 inch. It's yielded about 140 centimetres. So what's that? 8 inches is 21 centimetres square, and it's yielded me 140 centimetres, which is about 55 inches. So I've got plenty with an 8-inch square, and it's just pressed together. So I've not put that through a bias tape maker. I've just pressed the right sides together in half, and we're going to do it that way. And you just need to take the edge of your bias tape, not the folded edge, the raw edge of your bias tape, and you're going to be laying it all around your neckline towards the edge of the neckline, and that is right sides together. So you need to get some pins, pin that all the way around, right sides together. So the neckline's all pinned. I started at this end, which is the cut end, pinned it all the way around, pinned it so that it's in the direction that I'm sewing. The instructions don't tell you what seam allowance to give it to sew. So given that we started with 1 inch wide bias tape, folded it in half, which equals ½ inch wide bias tape, I'm going to sew that at somewhere between 1/8 of an inch and 1/4 of an inch. If I sew it bang on 1/4 of an inch, it's only going to give me 1/4 of an inch to turn it over and fold it in. So I want to sew somewhere between 1/8 of an inch and 1/4 of an inch, just to give me a little bit more to turn in and give it a nice looking neckline rather than a mean narrow looking neckline. I want to end up with about 3/8 of an inch to sew around the neckline. I'm going to sew around there, come back and show you what to do next. So whilst you're applying your bias binding to your neckline, you can do that to the top of the gauze as well. You just need a small amount. You're doing exactly the same thing, whereby you're applying it to the right side, aligning the cut edges to the top, sewing it at the same seam allowance that you sewed before, and then flipping it over and top stitching it. So you can do those at the same time as you do your neckline, and that just expedites things a little bit. So what I forgot to mention before I started sewing this is it doesn't actually tell you to stay stitch this neckline. It is on a V, so it is on the bias. So if you want to stay stitch it, you can do that if you want to. Obviously bear in mind where you're going to be stitching. So if you did like I did, where between 1/8 of an inch and 1/4 of an inch, you'd want to be stitching at about 1/8 of an inch so that the stay stitching is kept within the seam line. So now you can go ahead and trim your bias binding down. I didn't do it before, just to make sure that we had enough. And next step is just to press that seam allowance up all the way around. So you press that up all the way around, and then you're going to be bringing your bias binding inside to the wrong side. Now you might find that that wants a little trim. I tend to use these applique scissors, duckbill scissors, whatever you want to call them. You only need to do that if your seam allowance is going to be peeping over your bias binding. It shouldn't do, but you might have gone a bit wonky. So I'm going to hopefully leave mine in. So you're going to press that all the way around, rolling ever so slightly the bias binding to the inside, so you're not seeing it at the right side of the garment. So yeah, if you want to put a label in, you might want to catch it underneath there when you turn it over. So now's the time to think about that. So I'm just going to go ahead, press it all up, and then press it back down into the inside, rolling it ever so slightly to the inside, and then we need to go back and top stitch that bias binding down from the inside. Okay, so we're all pinned round on the inside, again in the direction that I'm going to sew. I've got my little label in there, and I'm just going to top stitch down. So I'm top stitching from the wrong side, just so that I catch all that bias binding. And I'm going to lengthen my stitch length to about 3, maybe 3.5, and then I'll come back when it's all done. Okay, so we're all stitched down. That's your right side, that's your wrong side, and just bob that to one side now. You're just going to work on the sleeves. So step 4 is telling you to finish off the flounces, which we already did. You're going to stitch your top flounce to your bottom flounce. So your upper flounce is the smaller one, that sits on the top, and your lower flounce is the larger one, and you want both right sides facing up. So right side's facing up, and you're just going to match all those notches that you put in very carefully, and you're just going to baste these two together so that it goes into the sleeve nice and neatly. So it should look like that. So we've got the two flounces pinned together, and then you're just going to sew them. It doesn't actually say what seam allowance to use. You're going to be sewing them to your top at 1 centimetre seam allowance. So long as you actually sew within that 1 centimetre seam allowance, then you should be okay, you should be good to go. Just double check that you've got both sides, both right sides facing up. So you've got the wrong side of your upper flounce facing the right side of your under flounce, and that you've got two opposite pieces. Can you see how they're curling in like that? So one goes that way and the other one goes that way. Just make sure just to double check that you haven't got two pieces the same, you haven't got two rights or two lefts. I'll come back when that's done, and then we're going to sew them into the bodice part of the dress. Okay, so I've got the sleeves sewn together, or basted together really. Flounces, aren't they? Not sleeves. So that's two flounces basted together. And now we're going to attach them to the main part of your bodice. So this is where the picture doesn't really bear any resemblance to what we're looking at really. The picture's got sort of a curve, I suppose it does a little bit, you've got a curve there, but it doesn't give any clues as to what you're marking up with what. So on your sleeve piece, you remember that you had 4 notches on your sleeve piece. One will be for the shoulder seam, one will go to the back, and then you will have 2 at the front, and one will line up with your bust dart and the other one will line up with the notch. I think it's labelled flounce. So you've got a notch here at the shoulder seam, you've got a notch right down here, and this is the back. And what you're doing, you've got your right sides of your sleeves together, so that's the under flounce. The shorter one is right sides with the right sides of the bodice of the dress or top that you're making. The end of the flounce will come to a notch on your bodice, which is, I've marked flounce. That notch should match up there. You should have a matching notch then at your shoulder seam, and a matching notch down here. Here you should match your notch at the bust dart, and then you will have an end flounce notch on your bodice as well. So it should all match up perfectly. So if you put pins in there and then put extra pins in as you need them, and then you just need to sew that at 1 centimetre, and you do that at both sides. So with your dress or your top the right way up, you've got your flounces facing in towards the neckline, so you don't want them that way, you want them facing in towards the neckline. Grab the Gore that you've already finished with the bias binding at the top, and you're looking for the side with the 2 notches, that's the front side. So that notch in the middle lines up with your bust dart. It should have a notch on. The second notch lines up with the bottom of the Gore, and then there should be a notch on your dress or your top which will match up with the top of the Gore, just there. So if you're pinning those 3 notches, and then you can pin your bottom. You just manipulate it, it will all fit in. And it might feel like it's a little bit loose there, and that's just because you're working with curves. It will all fit in at the seam line. If you just curve it in, it will all fit. So when you open it out, you'll see that the Gore is going to go underneath the sleeve. So you just need to sew that at 1 centimetre seam allowance on both sides. Once you've sewn those in, you're going to serge and overlock all the way around the armholes. From the top of the armhole here, all the way down to the bottom of the Gore. And you do that on both sides. If you haven't already overlocked your front seam allowances, you can do that now. The instructions actually tell you to sew up the middle first. You can do that. I'm doing it secondly just for expediency, so that you're doing similar jobs at the same time. So I've already overlocked it when I did my shoulder seams. So if you haven't already done so, you just need to put some interfacing down the side edges of your pockets, full length, just short of 1 centimetre wide. And you're going to put your pocket placements onto your dress, onto the markings. Probably covered up your notches on your pockets, but they're about 1 centimetre down. Just pin them with the pocket facing down because you want to be able to put your hands in. So you want to have your pockets facing down towards the hem and pin them in, and those pockets want sewing 0.6 centimetres, 1/4 of an inch. I want sewing onto your side seams, front and back. And so I'm going to sew my pockets and I'm going to sew my centre seam at the same time at 1 centimetre. Okay, so we're very nearly finished. What I've done is tried to do as much stitching at the same time and as much pressing at the same time as I can. So I've sewn on my 4 pocket pieces and then I've pressed them so that the seam allowance goes out towards the pocket pieces. So I've just pressed those flat, and then what we're going to do, it says top stitch, but I think it means under stitch. You're just going to go back in as close to that seam allowance as you can and under stitch down those 4 pocket pieces, and that just keeps them from flipping out when you're wearing them. So you do that on all 4 of them. And I've also at the same time pressed all my pocket pieces. I've pressed my sleeves or the flounces in towards the bodice, and I've also sewn up my centre seam and pressed that seam open. Now the reason why they do it like that is it just creates that really nice V. Can you see there? If you were to serge it together, you'd have quite a lump there and you'd have to press it to one side. The way that they do this creates a feature of the centre seam, and what you're going to do now is go in and top stitch down either side of that centre seam. You can decide what stitch length you want to do. You can go fancy. If you wanted to, you could have done a contrast colour in all your top stitching here and all the way down and made a real feature of it, depending on what you're wanting to do. I'm just going to use the white that I've been using all along, so it'll be quite subtle. I can adjust my machine needle. I can move it to the left or the right. So what I'll do is I'll keep my machine foot focused on the middle of that seam there, and I'll just move it to the right a couple of notches either side, and then it'll give me an even top stitch at either side. So you want it to be within this seam allowance of 1 centimetre. So what you're effectively doing is top stitching this seam allowance down here so that it doesn't flap about when it's being worn. So I'm going to go away now and do all my understitching and top stitching, and then there's just the side seams and the hem to do. Okay, so that's my pockets all understitched. Just stitched down there on all 4 of those. Gone down the centre front and done the top stitching there, which you probably can't see because it's just that subtle. And now all you need to do is sew your side seams together, and now might be a good time to baste those side seams and try it on if you're not confident that it's going to fit before you go all guns blazing and sewing it up without knowing whether it's going to fit. So like any other dress or top, it's right sides together. You're going to sew again at 1 centimetre seam allowance. You're going to sew up there up to about 1 centimetre beyond the bottom of that pocket, all the way around the pocket at 1 centimetre seam allowance, back in about 1 centimetre, and then you're going to sew up here until you hit the gore. It's all notched at this side. You're just lining it up with the notches. Just make sure that your flounces are tucked into the inside. Right side of your gore is hitting the underside of that flounce, and then you've got a notch there which denotes the top of your gore. You line that up, and then you've got another notch down here in the dress that you just match them up, and you're going to be sewing all the way down there. So that's the only strange bit really. Okay, so what I ended up doing was sewing from there into this bottom of this gore here at 1 centimetre seam allowance, and stopping exactly at the bottom of that gore, lifting my needle, cutting it, and then going back in and then flipping the work over and going back in and meeting up with where I ended sewing, so that I sewed from there, from the bottom of the gore downwards. Otherwise, if I'd have carried on sewing all the way down there, I would have got some awkward puckers, I think. So I think that's the only thing really that's not really very well explained in the instructions. So yeah, you want to start sewing from the top of the gore into the bottom of the gore, stop, back stitch either side, and then you want to flip that back over. So instead of it being open like that, flip it in and then start at 1 centimetre seam allowance at exactly the same spot and then all the way back round. And that just gives you a nice neat point on that Gore underneath your arm there. You might be able to carry on sewing, but I didn't want to risk it, so that's how I've done it. But you just need to go in now, finish your seam allowances on the inside. The one bit I forgot to do was serge these pockets here. I don't think it matters. Finish your seam allowances and then your hem and you're finished. Okay, so we're on the home stretch now. The side seams are all serged, and whilst I was at this overlocker or serger, I went ahead and I serged my hem. And I nearly always serge a hem before I finish it, just my preferred method. It just gives me a guide to fold with. So the instructions are telling you to do a double hem, and that's what I've done. It doesn't tell you what the depth of the hem is, but I've measured the bottom of the pattern pieces and the hem allowance is 1 centimetre. So essentially what you're doing is double folding 1/2 centimetre and another 1/2 centimetre. So all I've done is I've finished the hem with the overlocker. I've pressed it up by 1/2 centimetre and then I've pressed it again. And you just need to go in then and top stitch that. I do usually do a hem on a longer stitch, same as what I've been using for the rest of the garment. So that will be either 3 or 3.5 millimetre. And I will sew it from the wrong side so that I know that I'm catching it. Now it is quite tricky on a curved hem like this to get it stop it from puckering, and that's why you're better off with a narrow hem. And like I mentioned earlier, you can actually finish it with a bias binding, and a bias binding is actually a good alternative on such a steeply curved hem. I've done that here on this Cali dress, or Cali shirt it is, and it just does give you a nice finish. But I'm just going to do the normal double hem on this one today because I didn't make enough bias binding to finish it off with the bias binding, but that is a lovely alternative to finishing your dress. So I'm not going to film myself sewing it, but I'll come back and I'll show you what it looks like on. If you tried it on before you sewed up your side seams, then you would have had a fair idea of the length and whether you were happy with the length. Obviously you can't make it any longer, but I found when I was doing the top, that the top was more tunic length, so I actually tried it on and thought, no, I need to take about 1.5 inches, maybe 2 inches off that hem. With the dress, I think it's going to be the right length, mostly because these patterns are drafted for your height, so I don't have to add anything to it, which makes a nice change. So I'll come back when it's all finished. Okay, that's it. That's the dress all finished, and I will insert photographs of me wearing it so that you can see the finished product. The last thing you need to do really is just give it a really good press and then you're ready to go. So overall, really quite a quick sew. You're making your own bias binding, and if it's the first time you're using your overlocker to make the rolled hem, then that might take you a little bit longer, but practice and you'll get there. And don't be afraid of changing your threads on your overlocker. I was a long time before I like to mess about with it, but it's good fun. You can do all sorts on your overlocker. So leave me a comment below if you're planning on making this dress or top, and if you need any more advice, just let me know there. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and I will put a separate video together on Wednesday that will just feature doing these rolled hems on the overlocker. So that's it from me. Thank you very much for watching. I shall speak to you later. Bye.